All right, I want to welcome everyone. My name is Rob Dalrymple. Today is part 2 of a webinar on the question of Israel and apartheid. In our webinar last week, we opened with the questions, does Israel's treatment of the Palestinians amount to apartheid? We also asked, do accusations of apartheid delegitimize the state of Israel? Do they ignore the legitimate security needs that Israel faces? And do they needlessly add further flames to an already fragile conversation? So my name is Rob Dalrymple. I'm the Executive Director of Determined Truth Ministries, and I'm also a membership of the leader team of NIMI. I'm glad to be joined today by Mercy Aiken, NIMI's Relations Manager.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everybody. I am the Relationships Manager at NIMI. So first of all, I just feel obligated to remind everyone to please come and learn more about us. And you can do so at the nimi.network website. And if you're interested in having more content like this, access to further webinars and other things that we're doing, you can sign up for our short monthly newsletter. And you can also like and follow us on social media. And if you'd like to give help to support us in continuing work like this, it would be much appreciated. One of our goals at NIMI is to change the conversation about Israel and Palestine. We want to engage leaders and practitioners from diversity of perspectives. We want to help shape a conversation that will move us towards justice for all people. And so we especially want to equip pastors and leaders to respond to theological, ethical, social, and political issues pertaining to the Middle East, and especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we want to do this in accord with the gospel message of Jesus Christ, which is love and compassion and concern for everybody, no one left out. When it comes to Israel and Palestine, as you all know who are attending here, the conversation has become more intense in the last several years. And what we want to especially build our conversation around today is the fact that Amnesty International recently, I think it was earlier this year, and a number of other national and international human rights organizations in recent years have declared Israel to be an apartheid state. One of the concerns with this accusation is that it has legal ramifications because apartheid is illegal under international law. So today, we're not going to raise the question so much about is Israel an apartheid state or not, because we kind of talked about that in the first webinar. But what we want to talk about today is, regardless of how you feel on the terminology or the legitimacy of that term or what's going on over there, we want to ask the question, how should the church respond? Because on one hand, there is the plight of the Palestinians. And does raising the question of Israel and apartheid serve to draw awareness to their plight and their suffering? On the other hand, there's the present reality of anti-Semitism. So does raising this question of Israel and apartheid further encourage acts of anti-Semitism? And does it threaten the safety of Jews, not just in Israel, but even around the world? All very important, legitimate questions. So maybe you've come here with some questions, or maybe some questions are going to be provoked in you as you listen to our speakers. So we want to encourage you to engage as much as you can, according to the time restrictions we have, which is about an hour and a half. So we've disabled the chat right now, but we want you to please feel free to use the Q&A feature. You can ask specific questions to specific panelists, or you can direct a question to the panel in general. And Rob and I will do our best to go through these questions and get them to the appropriate people at the end of this conversation. So we are really happy to have a distinguished panel with us today, including Rob. Why don't you introduce the guests?
All right, thank you. I just want to clarify, we are going to go an hour and 15 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So we are excited to have a distinguished panel coming all the way from Israel, from Palestine, and from the U.S. Now, I'm not going to go in any particular order, but as they appear on my camera. So Dr. Munther Isaac is the academic dean and the professor of biblical studies at Bethlehem Bible College in Bethlehem, Palestine. He's also the pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Christmas Church in Bethlehem and the director of Christ at the Checkpoint Conferences. So he doesn't have a whole lot to do. He just kind of keeps busy a little bit. But his latest book is The Other Side of the Wall, a Palestinian Christian narrative of lament and hope, in which he lays out a vision for Jews, Christians, and Muslims one day sharing the land under God's justice, dignity, freedom, and equality. He's also the author of From Land to Lands, From Eden to the Renewed Earth, a Christ-centered biblical theology of Promised Land, and he completed his PhD at the Oxford Center for Mission Studies. So welcome, Munther. Hedva Haymov is the programs manager of Musalaha Ministry of Reconciliation, where she's worked for more than 15 years. She believes in the necessary and just treatment of all human beings. Part of her work is to coordinate meetings and training sessions for Israeli and Palestinian women who have committed to finding common ground and loving relationships. She grew up in the tri-state area, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland, and was raised as an assimilated Jew. It was after serving in the U.S. Army and returning to work in Washington, D.C. that she became a believer and has started attending a Messianic congregation, recovering her Jewish roots. Israel became important to her shortly thereafter, and she made Aliyah in 1992 and now lives in Israel. So welcome, Hedva. And Dr. Andrea Smith earned her bachelor's degree from Harvard University in comparative study of religion, master's from Union Theological Seminary, and then she received her PhD in the history of consciousness from the UC Santa Cruz. She's a practicing attorney, focusing on mostly, I believe, on disability rights. She's also the coordinator for Evangelicals for Justice and has been involved in reproductive justice organizing for over 30 years. So Andy, welcome. So we want to just begin. I know we just kind of gave a bio, but each of you take 1 minute, and that's for the preacher in the house also. 1 minute, just kind of introduce yourself a little bit more, your family, your background, whatever I might have left out, and what brought you to this issue. Let's begin with, we'll just go in the same order. Munther.
So in 1 minute, I guess good afternoon, friends, and thanks for joining us in this webinar. I am a Palestinian Christian. I've lived my life, almost all my life, here in Bethlehem, in Palestine. My life is defined by the current political reality, but more importantly, it's also defined my faith in Jesus Christ. And so I'm here in this conversation as a pastor, as a theologian, and also as a father. I have 2 children. Karam is 10 and Zaid is 8. And this discussion to me is not an academic discussion or a political debate. It's about our livelihood, and it's about the livelihood of my family and my children. So excellent. I'm happy to be part of this conversation.
Excellent, thank you. Hedva.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Hedva. I'm married, 2 children. When I came to Israel, I had only one perspective that I had heard, one narrative, that Israel, the Jews were coming back to live in Israel and the prophecy that's in the Bible. And when I got here, I saw that the reality on the ground was not exactly true. There were a lot of groups of people, especially the Palestinians, that were living here, and they were not being treated the same, and they didn't mix in most circles. The Jews and the Palestinians in most areas, even if they are allowed to be in the same city, only a few cities are mixed, and most people self-segregate. And of course, in the West Bank, there's a long wall and many red signs that they try to keep the Israelis and the Palestinians separate. Not only are they kept separate, but they are not given the same permissions, the same laws. They're not treated the same under in any justice system. And for me, that was unacceptable. And so I started working at Musalaha so that we can learn how to speak to each other. We can tear down the disinformation and the stereotypes and the dehumanization of each other so that we can learn to live together.
Amen. Excellent. Thank you, Hedva. Andy or Dr. Smith?
I'm not into titles, so Andy's sufficient.
Andy's great, yeah.
So to make a long story short, I've theologically conservative, been involved in Southern Baptist churches most of my life, where kind of the litmus test is very much a certain position on Israel and Palestine. But then politically, I've been involved on not conservative political spaces where it's the litmus test in the other direction. And I just found an inability to have a conversation. But at the same time, I found in my organizing work that if you just reframe the topic, people change their mind on the topic, this topic, faster than any other topic I've talked to people with. So I've just come to see the importance of generally learning how to talk to people, because I think, you know, there ends up being kind of this binary that doesn't need to exist to this degree if we could reframe the issues differently.
Amen. That's great. We want to now, first of all, thank you guys for your short introductions. It was wonderful. Now we're going to just begin with some conversation. So I want to ask a question, which I'm going to direct to each of you around this idea, which is the designation of Israel as an apartheid state helpful, in your opinion, to the ongoing conversation? Or does it hinder the process of bringing about a just solution? So I'm going to direct my first question to Hedva, and then to Munther, and then to Andy. I'm just going to ask you right now so you guys can remember your questions, and then you can answer the question in that order. So Hedva, this is your question. From an Israeli perspective, what are your thoughts? You already kind of expanded on this. What are your thoughts to this question? And can you also give us a sense of how other Israelis might respond? Because I'm aware that your position isn't necessarily the mainstream for all Israelis. Second question is to Munther. From a Palestinian perspective, what are your thoughts to this question? And does the designation of Israel as an apartheid state help or hinder efforts with regard to the plight of the Palestinians? And then for Andy, from an American perspective, what are your thoughts on this question? You know, you talked about kind of reframing the debate a little bit or coming in with a different approach. So I'm very curious how you process this particular question. So we'll start now with Hedva, then we'll go to Munther, and then Andy.
As you pointed out, Mercy, there are going to be a myriad of views among the Israelis on the use of the word apartheid. The majority will probably not continue to speak after they hear that word.
Right.
And so because my position is that I arrange meetings between Israelis and Palestinians, things that I might believe and things that I might agree with or not agree with, I have to put to the side in order to facilitate groups of Israelis and Palestinians. So one of the things that we talk about, and one of the skills that we teach our women, is that listening to someone's story and someone's pain is very, very important. However, the words we choose are kind of like a piece of wrapped candy. It's the meaning that I want to get across to you. And if I use the wrong wrapper on my candy, the wrong word, I won't be able to get the meaning across to you because you'll be triggered. Mm-hmm. So in both ways, in both conversations, there's many words that we might not want to use, even though they might be very important. Sometimes we have a discussion for an hour just about one word. There's a lot of pain, there's a lot of conflict that's connected to these words. And so it depends on where we want to put our emphasis. If we're having a conversation and trying to build a relationship between two people, are we going to spend our time now on this one word of apartheid or occupation, even though it's important and we might need to have that conversation later on? Or are we going to be able to tell our story to someone in a way that they can hear us? The facts of the matter are all the same. It's the label that you're putting on that can stop people from hearing you. That's all I had to say about that.
Very good. So you're really approaching it from the perspective of dialogue, like interrelationship dialogue, which is very, very important. Munther, let's go to you.
Well, I hate to begin by saying I strongly disagree with my good friend Hedva. So let me say this. The question was, is it
It's
helpful?
okay, Munther. It's not the first time.
The question on whether it's helpful or not. And is it a hindrance? Let me take it word by word. Is it helpful? I think that's the wrong question, with all due respect. I don't care if it's helpful or not. What matters, is it the truth or is it not? The question of apartheid is not about a perspective or an opinion. You don't ask someone, what is your opinion? Do you think this is apartheid or not? Apartheid has a legal definition. You ask for a criteria. Does it fit or it does not fit? If it does, then it is apartheid. If it does not fit, then it is not. So it's not a matter of what I think, what I perceive, whether I think it's helpful or not. It's a matter of facts on the ground. So that's, I think, it's important to begin with that question. And I think it's important to emphasize this, especially for us as Christians, because we must always not just say the truth, but take sides in these discussions. And the question about hindrance, hindrance assumes that something is actually working, and now we're putting a hindrance on it. It was not working to begin with. Nobody is paying attention to our misery and suffering for years. So now the talk about hindrance assume that now that we are going to say apartheid, we're stopping a progress. There was no progress to begin with. And so maybe now this is actually a good strategy. But I want to communicate to you how these questions about hindrance and was it helpful or not, how they come across to me as a Palestinian, because this is important. Now I am being told that when I speak about my suffering and when I describe my reality, I have to cater and be sensitive to the feelings of my oppressor. And I just want you to think how is that then perceived. At the same time, when I told this is not helpful and this will shut discussions with the Western Church in Germany or USA, at the same time, this is what I'm hearing, that I have to be sensitive to the Western Church's emotions and feelings and realities in order to be heard. And, I cannot accept this. And maybe what Hedva was saying could be true if we're talking about a normal conflict between two sides. But in a situation when there is clearly a powerful side and an oppressor and an oppressed, the agreement of most that this is apartheid, most legal and human rights organization, things are so desperate on the ground and urgent. Honestly, I don't think we have the time, because of the sense of urgency, to cater for the emotions or to try as if, to walk slowly so that those on the other side will hear us, because if we're aggressive, they won't hearing us. As I said, they're not hearing us to begin with, and so on. If I address now the question in a different way, I think, and especially speaking about when I speak to Christians who don't want this question to be heard, to me, the real question is, why are people avoiding this word? Why? I think to me, this is the real scandal, that the church is trying to silence us when we describe the reality on the ground as apartheid. The real question is why? Why are they doing this to us? So this is how I look at this question.
I really almost want to follow through with you. You brought up so many good points, but we're going to move on to Andy. But I'm sure some of what you said has already raised some questions that maybe some people in the audience may be thinking about. Please feel free to send them to us via the Q&A if Rob and I don't get to them. So Andy, if you want to finish up on this question with your answer.
Well, I think all words are helpful and not helpful at the same time. And I find rather than fixate on the word, what is the conversation trying to be enabled by the word? And let's just have that conversation, because it ends up being a debate, yes or no, versus why was that articulated as such and what was trying to be told by doing that. And to me, there's many conversations with that word we could have a conversation on. Like, to me, I'll just give a few that could be the many. A question to me that arises from that is, can any nation state that defines itself on racial, ethnic, or religious grounds not be an apartheid state? Right? Is apartheid endemic to kind of the creation of nation state formations, generally speaking? Does that make sense? This leads to another question then. Is the goal of any kind of national determination struggle a nation state? Is that the best goal? Or are there other goals that we might imagine? Here I'm thinking of the insights, particularly of indigenous, but not exclusively so, of indigenous struggles that have argued that we should fight for indigenous nationhood that's inclusive rather than exclusive and is not based on exclusive control of land or territory. Hence, we have to rethink the relationship between peoples and land. So this becomes a whole other conversation. Another conversation that gets enabled by this is, why is Israel in particular getting marked and not, say, the United States, which is completely built on apartheid? So in what way is just apartheid generally, the normalization of it getting ignored and it's treated as an exceptional rather than a normal characteristic of nation state formations? So if we have this creates a different possibility to say, what do we want? Like, what is the best way to structure governance in the world? What's the best way to understand liberation? What's the best way to connect liberation struggles with all other liberation struggles? Because we know we're all part of a larger world. And so instead of, when we hear the word, our heads explode, does that make sense? Either having a strong opinion one way or the other, we say, let's go, okay, let's talk about this. What are we trying to say with this conversation? That I think it can be something constructive and builds us to another place. If I could have a slight disagreement on kind of legal definitions of word, law to me is not neutral, right? Law has its own things. So even under international law, right, genocide kind of conveniently gets defined in a way to try to exclude indigenous genocide, right? There's political motivations by how legal terms get divided. So I'm not saying throw it out, but it's not sacrosanct itself. Like, we have to look at the political machinations that go behind legal definitions, because laws get defined in a certain way to serve some interests and not other interests. So that should always be part of the conversation as well, right? It's not just, it's the law, it's it in or not, but why is the law defining it this way? And do we agree or not agree? Maybe it should be bigger, maybe it's just smaller, maybe we think of the law differently speaking. But the law is part of politics. It's not separate from politics, in my opinion.
Excellent. And I'm going to come back to that question with you in just a second. I want to go a little bit further with Mercy's thought. But let's go back to Munther and Hedva, and specifically Hedva to begin with. And that is, I totally understand the idea that you said it's a trigger word. It's going to stop the conversation. But I think you recognize that this is an important conversation. I mean, from your opening words, this is a conversation that needs to be had. And based kind of on what Andy just indicated there also, is there a way to still have this conversation? Because I think that's the point, right? The point is something's going on that some have labeled as with a word of apartheid. Is how do we have this conversation and how do we go forward?
Well, I think, you can list off the facts and the amount, let's say, of children under 18 that are being held in military prisons without representation and without their parents. The fact that they, just passed, or several years ago, passed the nation state law that says Israel is a Jewish state, and thereby everyone else is a second-class citizen. There's lots of experiences that people have in their lives that need to be discussed and need more, how can I say, more to be visualized by everyone. It's very easy for Israelis to turn off their television and not go look over the wall, or not go look at the next neighborhood and see that it's being treated differently than their own. They don't pick up the trash. They don't have police that come through and keep the peace. So in order for them to open their eyes, we need to have these conversations, and we need to tell people this is my experience. Let me tell you my story. Now you tell me your story. And so that we can be advocates, especially for the pain and suffering of people who have had so much taken from them.
Munther, let's give you.
Can I just jump in? I just want to
please.
clarify something that Hedva was saying. When they don't pick up the trash or the police come, that would have been an Israeli responsibility in those neighborhoods, that they were
Oh, good
neglecting
point.
them because they were Arab. Not that the
Absolutely.
Arabs were failing to do what they should be doing.
No,
good
no,
point.
absolutely.
okay.
I mean, even in
Yeah.
places where Arab neighborhoods and homeowners have to pay their property taxes, they don't have the same services as Israeli neighborhoods.
Right.
Because it's an occupied territory, Israel is responsible
No,
for all
no,
this.
even inside of Israel. Thank you very much.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Even
okay.
inside of Israel, you know, and you can say occupied territory in many different ways.
Yeah, okay,
But,
interesting. Okay.
You know, if there's Tel Aviv and Lod, you're going to have different responses from the police, different responses from fire, different responses from collecting trash and access to medicine.
Interesting. So Munther, would you give, if you have any thoughts on this, that, the term for you is helpful because it's a conversation, it's not hindering a conversation because nothing was working to begin with. So in light of this, what are your thoughts? Do you have a response there?
Yeah, and I want to, some things were raised. I think so. What is it that we hope to achieve with this? I think that was Andy's comment. To me, the most important thing is we need to hold Israel accountable for what it is doing. We cannot continue to normalize the state of Israel just any normal state. And to be honest, it's not just to me holding Israel accountable, but holding Israel's allies accountable in many cases. So the question of why are we using it? I want to ask the question. I mean, if everybody agrees, and we need laws, we need parameters. We cannot just have any discussion where the law becomes a matter of opinion. So we need these parameters. And if Israel is clearly breaking human rights and international law, then who's going to hold Israel accountable? To me, what Hedva now said about bringing real stories and so on, these are exactly the stories I want also to raise. The fact that, children are being put to jail without representation, military courts. The fact that, when I think of some of my friends who are Palestinians, who lived here, their families lived here even before Israel was created, and now they cannot unite with their spouses because their spouses don't have a Palestinian ID, and Israel does not give them the visa or the right to live, residency to live in there. And so imagine the cruelty of the law where a Palestinian cannot even live with his or her spouse in their homeland and ultimately have to immigrate. And we have to see this, while any Jewish person around the world can move, live in our land, have more rights than ours. Are we okay with that? What are we doing with that? So when I want to say, okay, let's use the term, this is not about scoring political points in a political debate. It's not at all. It's about stopping this, these acts that are hindering our presence, our lives as Palestinians, that are corrupting the image of God in the Palestinians, and from a personal perspective, emptying our land from its people, especially I'm concerned about the Christian presence. So who's holding Israel? So this is what the discussion to me is about. And trying to avoid it and just make it as a conflict, let's get to know one another. It doesn't really, to me, my fear is that it will just continue. It will just continue.
It doesn't change things on the ground for you, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So let's turn to Andy here. So because the framing question that we're having in this particular conversation is how does the church respond? And I think this has been a great conversation so far. So, I want to remind everyone, by the way, to put your comments in the chat and the Q&A thing. If you have any questions that we can try to raise, if we have time here at the end, we hope to get that. But, Andy, the American church has done a good job of pointing our fingers at everybody else and noting all their problems. And America is really good at this too. And you do a lot of work with justice in the United States, especially, but not only with indigenous peoples. And so what is the role in your mind of the church in the United States in addressing our own sins of racism, gender discrimination, and treatment of the indigenous peoples? And you hinted at this already. And then how does this affect our role in the discussion of Israel and Palestine?
Well, yes, because I think, in other words, you can have a legitimate critique of the state of Israel, but say it in an anti-Semitic way. And people can't seem to hold the two together. Does that make sense? So the Christian church has to be particularly responsible because it's built on anti-Judaism. So to act like Christians can just jump into this without looking at complicity in all areas simultaneously, like at the same time, is not of benefit. And in particular, in the United States, in other words, to exceptionalize Israel is to normalize the genocide and apartheid situation here. Like none of this should be normalized. Like what's going on in Israel should not be normalized, but it shouldn't be normalized anywhere on planet Earth. Like this should be seen as something that we're engaged in, globally speaking. And I just slightly say I wouldn't use the word American, right? Because America refers to all of the hemisphere. And that can be kind of a US centrism that kind of invisibilizes the Americas, generally speaking. So one, I think we just want to do that. And then two, another conversation I think needs to be put on the table, at least how I see it, is that why is it difficult? Why is, back to Munther's question, like, why would we have to avoid the term apartheid? Well, there seems to be then an underlying assumption there that a people seeking liberation have to be perfect. Does that make sense? So therefore, in this particular case, if Israel does something wrong, then you cannot bring up anti-Semitism. But to me, that's like the unfair burden that's put on any group, right? Like you have a right to justice even if you suck. Like you don't have to earn the right to freedom. You don't have to earn the right to liberation. If God is against injustice, period, right? So those two don't have to be extinguished. The assumption seems to be, if one were to look at the apartheid conditions in Israel, therefore, we don't have to care about anti-Semitism. No, you do both, right? You end apartheid conditions in Israel, or however you would describe it, and anti-Semitism simultaneously speaking. So therefore, I think maybe if we just kind of eliminate this burden of perfection that is placed on everyone seeking justice, and instead say, we're all actually, it's hard to like be perfect after thousands of years of white supremacist settler colonial shenanigans. So we're all struggling together to be less bad together, to be better together. Like our struggles need to actually be engaged with each other. So it's not a bad thing when our struggle gets critiqued. That doesn't mean you're against us, and it doesn't mean it's bad even for us. We should hear it because it actually is going to help our liberation struggle. It's going to help our people when we learn how we could become better. It's not against us. That's something that helps us. It's something that's for us. If we could internalize that, the desire to hear critique, to hear criticism, rather than avoid it, does that make sense? Then we can see it as a blessing rather than something that's against us, because we know that when we make a mistake, that does not in any way eliminate our rights to justice. So putting these as a zero-sum game is itself the problem that maybe we want to challenge.
That's great, Andy. As you were talking, I was thinking to myself, like, I just want to pick your brain on how we can like bring together the voices of people who feel that they are in a liberation struggle or striving for more freedom or to correct wrongs, like that we are all on the same side and we don't have to be in opposition with each other. And especially in the framing of Israel-Palestine, I think if we could find the key to that, it would be like a golden key. And so I just want to throw that out there even to the audience and anyone else who watches this later, is like something to think about and ruminate on and find ways to do that. But I have a question now for Munther. Munther, we know that many US, not American, thank you, Andy, many US evangelicals have theological convictions regarding Israel. And especially the founding of the State of Israel and then 1967 following have only served to strongly reinforce these convictions. So knowing where U.S. evangelicals are coming from with this thought in mind, can you help us understand how the evangelical church has contributed? How have we contributed? And this is, you're answering this not just for the panel here, but for the church in the United States. How have we contributed to the ongoing conflict and the oppression of the Palestinian people? And please be frank with us. We need your truth-telling.
Yes. Thank you. I cannot but comment about some of the things I heard. I'll answer this for sure. I want to emphasize that the question Andy, I wish things were as you described them, but I feel every time I speak, I am scrutinized, and I have to be, because I wish we had just the freedom to speak. But anyways, and the question on anti-Semitism, a Jewish friend of mine told me that actually these accusations all the time water down real anti-Semitism. Whenever we speak as Palestinians about our situation, and that question comes, many feel that this does water down. And with apartheid, we have American and Israeli Jewish leaders using this word. So to your question, Mercy, the theological convictions. I always say that an American Christian by default, you don't have to teach, for example, Christian Zionism in a church. It comes by default. The normal Christian in a pew assumes that Israel is the right side and reads the Bible, thinks of the word, Israel, and connects it. Almost every American Christian I've talked to, and I ask him about the statement, Jews returning to their homeland, and they say, yeah, we know this, we use this, even that, which might come across as a simple statement, not a theological statement, to me that's problematic. Jews coming home to their homeland assumes that this is not my land, assumes that I'm taking someone else's land. And then it goes beyond that to convictions that Israel is a fulfillment of prophecy, or that this is the first part of the restoration of the Jewish people, the covenantal relationship with Israel as Jewish people, as a nation, as continues today, and by extension, not just the covenantal relationship, it includes the land, and as such, Jews have a divine right. All of these theological beliefs have been translated over the years into political action and into financial support to Israel, billions of dollars, often to settlement projects, to the army. They're not giving billions of dollars to Musalaha or to the Bible College, or these are billions of dollars coming from evangelical churches, sometimes even to right-wing groups in Israel. When I think of that, it's funding the immigration, as I said, supporting the army, and of course, political support to Israel. When Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he said, and I quote, "I did it for the evangelicals." And one more way of all of that is that it silences any criticism sometimes of Israel, or just uses very soft language. Israel is not a perfect state, but we pray for peace, and so on. When we speak as Palestinian Christians, we've been attacked, we've been silenced by supposedly our sisters and brothers. And to me, one of the most troubling issues when it comes to this kind of thinking is that it totally eliminates our presence as Palestinians. Mm-hmm. Going back to the most simple language, I'm not going to attack Christian Zionism or John Hagee or this. A simple statement like Jews return to their homeland, again, assumes that me as a Palestinian who've been living here for hundreds, if not more, of years, as if I have been occupying someone else's land. Israel is a fulfillment of prophecy. When Israel was created, we lost more than 78% of our land. We lost, or so, 800,000 Palestinians became refugees. Just think of that number alone. So why would God do this to us as Palestinians in order to fulfill a prophecy? These questions or these assumptions in their action, in what they're saying and what they're not saying, completely ignore, dehumanize, and ignore us as Palestinians, and have been, used to justify what's happening, to empower what's happening over against our existence as Palestinians and as Palestinian Christians in this land. We have been speaking about this for years. We have been talking about this for years. Sometimes, people think, no, these are just marginal groups. Why do you focus on them? And I say, look at what their power and what they were able to do during the Trump presidency. Don't tell me this is a marginal group. This is mainline American Christianity. And to us, this is a real problem.
That's
Well,
very
thank you.
good.
Hedva, let me ask you, as an Israeli who lives, in Israel, you obviously have, I'm certain, a heightened awareness of anti-Semitism, but you work towards reconciliation. In the midst of this conflict, what would you say to American Christians when it comes to, or Christians in the United States, thanks, Andy, Christians in the United States who are advocating for peace and justice for Israelis and Palestinians? Or when it comes to the issue of advocating for peace and justice for the Israelis and Palestinians?
I would tell them the journey, what happened to me. I came from a secular background, and my only connection with the church was when I became a believer, and then I went to a Messianic Jewish congregation. And their emphasis was on prophecy and Jews moving back to Israel. But one thing that was lacking, and I think it's the key maybe, they didn't talk about the character of God. The character of God is justice. The character of God means I need to love my enemy. I need to pray for others. I need the best for others.
Right.
And one of the things that my boss wrote in Through My Enemy's Eyes, if my theology doesn't bless the other, there's something wrong with my theology.
Amen. It's
not Jesus's message for me to go and beat someone and steal their land and put their children in jail. It's not what Jesus would do. And so if that's what I'm doing or my people's doing, we need to be self-critical. We need to pull ourselves out of the out of the mire and out of the mud. And we need to clean up our act. It cannot be by force. It cannot be by killing other people. It doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. It cannot be justified.
Amen. Thank you so much for that, Hedva. I saw there was a lot of very positive response from the people in the audience while you were talking. And I do think, just bringing it back to the character of God is a very, very powerful way. I think that anyone who is a believer in the God that we read about in the Bible, that we can draw people into unity around a discussion and bring up an important discussion around that people, because it's very scriptural, they have to respond to. I have a question kind of dovetailing off of that, but I'm curious, in your experience with the evangelical world in the United States, kind of like the question I asked Munther, have you found like our response over here helpful or detrimental to the Jewish people as a whole, especially the Jewish people in Israel? Like, how can we do better? So again, speak the truth to us and tell us, from your perspective, what you think, we most prophetically need to hear from an Israeli believer living in the land.
Thank you. One of the, the Psalms that I hear people talk about all the time is pray for the peace of Jerusalem. It's really important to know who lives in Jerusalem. They're not just Jewish people. And in fact, most of the Jewish people live outside of Jerusalem. So please pray for the Armenians, the Palestinians, the Bedouins. Please pray for Druze people, and pray for us to treat each other with kindness and compassion, so that we can live together, so that we can treat each other with respect and legally, hold each other up. And the most important thing, in my opinion, is you cannot support one and not support the other. So don't give billions of dollars to Israel for their military and then not give anything to the Palestinians. Don't give anything to anybody. Keep your money, stay right there, leave us alone, and let us fix it ourselves.
So we've made it worse.
We're good at that. We're good at that. Let me follow up, Munther. You noted at the beginning of your conversation that it's a question of whether or not this is a truth, whether it really is a reality. It's not the question that we raised to you is bringing up the topic of apartheid a help or a hindrance, and you're like, it can't be a hindrance because that assumes that something was working to begin with, and it's not working. And I kind of heard from you, if you don't mind me asking it this way, almost a prophetic call to us. I just wrote a blog that just appeared on my website regarding the fact that most Christians, when they hear about topics of justice and injustice, their response is like, I didn't know this. And I would say to you, Munther, that I think that most of our churches simply don't know this information. And so when I look at the question of Israel and an apartheid state, I think, well, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure. I kind of look at what Hedva had to say, and like it's a trigger word. We got to be careful of that. But what I think happens from that question is that it begins to raise an awareness, like, well, why would you even say that? And as a result, it then begins to raise the question of, hey, what's happening in the land that's affecting Arabs and Palestinians? And so kind of, do you mind speaking to that a little bit here? Say, hey, look, guys, you need to understand what's really happening here. And this, as a pastor, professor, kind of give your response to the American church, American evangelical church in particular, that you were pointing out.
As someone who lives in the land, Rob,
Right.
Forget pastor or a theologian, or as someone who lives in the land, as a father who lives in the land, does our perspective or our stories matter? And yes, we need to tell stories. We need to share what's happening on the ground. The issue, I mean, what you said to me, the problem is that the church is already involved. So how can you be so much involved if you don't really know what's happening on the ground? This is where the serious problem is with me. It's not as if the church in the USA is neutral. It's not neutral. So I want to say it in a nice way. Educate yourself, get to know what's happening, and ignorance is no longer an excuse. But it goes beyond that sometimes. And here is how. It goes beyond that, in that when we try to speak as Palestinian Christians, when we try to give our perspective, when we try to say, hey, we live here and we have a perspective, we're not always given the opportunity, Rob. Let's be honest. There are still strong sense of prejudice against Palestinians. And the fact that, I only get the hearing and the ears of many Americans only because I'm a pastor also troubles me. I take advantage of it, don't get me wrong. I'm glad that they're listening to me because I'm a pastor, but why are people not giving any, weight to the voice and perspective of Palestinians? Give us a chance, listen to us. As I say in my book, step to the other side of the wall and listen. The problem is that walls have been there. People don't want to listen to our side. We've been pushed aside. And as I shared in my book, even when I tried politely to get to be part of a debate about the land, I'm not given the chance. And I tried many times, in websites, in magazines, in conferences, and many times we're not giving the chance. I think this reveals a certain attitude of superiority, if you wish. We know better. Rob, you can't imagine how many times, I had conversations with American evangelicals, not about the Bible and interpretation and theology, but about facts on the ground. They want to tell me what's happening in my neighborhood. They think they know better than me what's happening in my neighborhood. So that's the real issue here. It's not just that people don't know. Yes, I agree. Many times when people hear, their eyes are open and they say, we didn't know, we wish we knew. But many times people don't want to know, or if they know, they think it cannot be true because we know better. And I think that's even more dangerous than we don't simply know.
That's a really, really good point, Munther. I often felt the same way when I was over in Bethlehem and I would talk about something, and then people who, weren't even over there would write me and try to explain to me what was going on outside my window. And it was just so frustrating. And that kind of brings up a question that I wanted to direct to Andy. Munther raised a lot of points about feeling, or his experience, not just his feelings, his experience of being marginalized and silenced as a Palestinian. And every Palestinian I've talked to has told me this: doors slammed in their face when they find out that this person is a Palestinian. To me, I find that very racist, at its core. And I was just wondering, Andy, in your experience, if you could just speak to that a little bit, how has the evangelical church in the USA, how has our approach to this conversation contributed to Islamophobia or anti-Arabism in the USA? We've talked a lot about anti-Semitism, but there is this whole other aspect of racism that's also going on.
Yes, exactly. Because in fact, I think Christianity in general, besides being constructed through anti-Judaism, kind of as an internal enemy, has always been constructed with Islam as the external enemy, and it's actually kind of a blueprint for indigenous genocide. So we have to see this as fundamentally entwined in Christian theology. It's not just a simple prejudice, but how Christian theology has been constructed. And generally speaking, if we're going to do self-critique, U.S. evangelicals have to do some serious critique. It's not simply having the wrong position on issue, but the way it's been constructed to always feel like we're on the side of righteousness. I believe one person calls it Disney princess theology, always identifying with Jesus on the cross when in fact we would have been the Romans. So if you kind of rethink things, does that make sense? Instead of thinking we're actually on the side of righteousness, assume we're on the side of non-righteousness about 99.9% of the time, and then reconstruct church as being the place where we struggle to be less unrighteous, where we struggle to learn from each other. And the other issue, being on the side of righteousness, there's the tendency to assume I don't have to listen to anyone who I have deemed to be non-righteous. And this is ridiculous, because you should learn to listen to everyone on planet Earth, because everyone has something to tell you that you need to learn from. So instead of putting people in the category of non-listenable, assume we need to hear everyone's stories, as Hedva was saying, and hear the insight that we're missing, where Jesus is appearing, but we can't even recognize Jesus because Jesus is not in the label we would have presumed. So when we're getting down to, if we're going to be in a constructive way, evangelical theology needs to be fundamentally reformulated. And it's a systemic problem. It's not simply, as Munther was saying, ignorance, right? The ignorance is playing in this way because evangelical theology is constructed in such a messed up manner.
So reflecting back, I loved your analogy of the Disney princess. Like, one of the most helpful things that we could do is kind of decenter ourselves as like the heroine, the righteous heroine of the story, and just kind of dial ourselves down maybe and take a more humble listening approach to everyone.
Yeah, and I'd like to cite that Erna Kim Hackett was kind of who formulated that, so I don't want to cite that as mine, but yes. But I think she made that important intervention is, we always see ourselves as the heroes when we're usually not. Does that make sense? So if we were to, again, be comfortable with being wrong and presuming we're wrong most of the time, then we would have a chance to work collectively with others to be less wrong in the future. And I think Jesus formulated this when Jesus said, I'm here to create a church for the sinners. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not a church of the saints. It's the church for people who are thoroughly messed up, so that we can be less messed up together. That is the point of church. I think if you were to reformulate church differently, you'd have a better shot of doing better in the world.
Amen. Amen. And we have some questions in the, go ahead, Mercy.
No, I was just going to say, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And that's what scripture was coming to my mind while you were talking.
Yeah, excellent.
Go, Rob.
We have some questions in the Q&A session. I want to encourage you that if you have any other questions, so throw them in the Q&A function there, and we'll try to get to them as best we can, as we're running a little bit low on time. We want to give each of our presenters an opportunity to kind of give some closing thoughts also. But one of the questions that came in, and I'm going to direct this to Hedva, and obviously if Munther or Andy, if you have a response, also feel free to do so. And it says, why is the concept of equality for all of its citizens so threatening to the state of Israel? And that obviously assumes that it is threatening, but the very existence of separate categories or levels of citizenship places Israel in the realm of being an apartheid state. And maybe one of you can speak, maybe Hedva, if you can speak to the national law that was just passed, and kind of explain that in case people that are listening don't know what that means, that Israel's a state for the Jewish people. But why should we be less concerned with whether or not the perpetrator of apartheid is offended by the use of the term? It's a quite simple reality. The word apartheid has a legal definition. If Israel or any state meets that definition, then they are, in fact, an apartheid state. No need to sugarcoat it, because the perpetrator of the apartheid finds the term to be offensive. So, Hedva, why don't you speak to that first and kind of help us a little bit with the nation-state law, and then Munther or Andy, if you have a comment, also feel free. We'll turn it to you.
So the nation-state law is, many people have tried to pass it for the last 50, 60 years, but they finally were able to do it in 3 years ago, that defines Israel, who does not have a constitution, as not only a democratic state, but a Jewish state, in so much that any Jew that can prove that they're Jewish from anywhere in the world can consider this their homeland. Why are the Israelis, I would have to say Israelis, concerned and divide people into groups ethnically? I think, and it's just my own perspective, you're dealing with the people who have a generational trauma, and they use or they repeat the national narrative of the Holocaust over and over and over and over. I cannot tell you how many times they repeat it in school every year, so that when you graduate school in 12th grade, you have gone over it and over it and over it. It's in the community centers, it's in the museums, it's in most every speech that comes out of a politician's mouth. There is a benefit to it on a national level, so that they can, if there's an outside enemy, it makes them more unified on the inside. So you have people coming from all over the world with every culture and every language, and making it into one people group. So they're doing their best to form this into a one unified nation of Jews. And how do you do that? Is you make sure that everybody believes that there is an imminent threat. And so you repeat your narrative, you tell everybody that they need to be afraid, and then you get people that will, come into the draft very easily. They'll go into the army without another thought. They'll do whatever you tell them and shoot whoever you tell them to shoot. And the repetition of all of this in every area of the country, causes this fear of what they don't know or fear from the outside.
Mhm.
And to be perfectly frank with you, inside the borders of Israel, we're not even talking about the West Bank. Every year, when they count and do the census, they tell you what the most popular names of children, but they only print the Israeli names. The actual names would be Muhammad and another young lady's name that's Arabic, because there's more Arabic children being born every year in Israel than from Jewish parents, but they don't print that.
Interesting. Munther, do you want to follow up with that question also, or if you have any thoughts?
Yeah, just a quick comments. I think I wanted to say, and I saw it also in a comment, that one of the serious issues with the nation state law, I mean, it's all problems, but one of the serious issues is when it says that the right for self-determination is exclusive to the Jewish people only. So to me, this is constitutional, not just discrimination, but privileging of one over the other. And I agree, I think, with what Hedva says as analysis, but I think there is even more to that, in the sense that we hear a lot of notions of Jewish supremacy today in the Israeli society, especially in the religious right, in the extreme religious wing, which is no longer a marginal group, which is now shaping governments and an important, they get a lot of votes and so on. So there is that sense that, we're better, even the sense that an Arab life is less worthy maybe than the Jewish life and so on. So I agree with what Hedva says, but I think there's also more to it than just trauma from the past. I think it has been translated into notions of Jewish supremacy. The nation state law says that, in the sense that only Jews have the right for self-determination.
That's good.
Can I add one thing to what Munther just said?
Always.
You're right that there is in Judaism especially, there is an idea of a Jewish soul having more worth, but not just over Palestinians. You guys need to know that it's over all non-Jews. So if you're supporting this idea, you need to know that if you're a non-Jew, you are being looked at from a different perspective from your Israeli, the people that you're speaking to.
I was gonna say, like not an answer, but this just made me think of the World Social Forum, Indigenous Peoples Platform said the big issue they want to put on the table is the nation state, right? That's the problem, because it presumes, in this particular case, for Israel to be a home for Jewish people means it's exclusively for Jewish people, that there couldn't be multiple homes. Where in their articulation, they said, our vision is not that other people need to leave our lands. Everyone can be here because the land isn't owned by anyone. Rather, we all have to be in a good way with all other nations and be in a right way with all of creation. So rethinking the assumption of what a nation is, maybe puts a different possibility if we think the assumption that nation means exclusive control of land or territory.
That's good. Andy, I want to direct another question that's in the chat to you, and the other two, please feel free to join in, Munther and Hedva, as you feel. But you've talked a lot about kind of finding this middle way or stepping outside of the central conflict terminology and finding just a new way to discuss issues in which people's minds are changed. And I'm wondering what you would say to this question from David Crump in the audience, who says, some like Gideon Levy is an Israeli journalist, for those who don't know. He's written a long time for Haaretz. Some like Gideon Levy say that Israel is incapable of fixing itself, quote unquote. So how can U.S. Christians help to pressure Israel from the outside? And again, I'm asking you this because I feel like you have found some ways maybe that are more helpful or gracious or somehow can bring people together. And I think that's a question that a lot of evangelicals feel like if they do start to learn a little bit about what's going on, how do I then speak up? How do I then engage without alienating my Jewish friends and Israeli friends who I want to legitimately, care for their safety and try to not alienate them as much as possible? So if you could speak to that, we'd love to hear your wisdom.
Well, and global oppression and 5 easy steps. Well,
yes, all of it, all of it.
I feel like there's so much to be said that can't be said quickly, but what I heard today from Hedva and Munther, I feel like synthetically speak to this, right? What I heard from Hedva is we can get trapped in like the right thing, but we lack the relationality. Like we're not connecting with people, developing the relationships with them, right? But then I hear from Munther, we presume in being relational that we can't also be prophetic, that we cannot be relationally prophetic, right? We can't say what's actually happening. And I think when we combine the two, I guess I haven't seen it to be such a huge challenge. When you're invested in people, when you show you're invested, you create the relationships, then you create the possibility to say the truth, as you would see it, or to say prophetic things that are happening. So I don't see it as a middle way at all. Like I feel like middle way gets positioned in a strange thing. I think it's more, let's change the terms of the debate. Like somebody said, and where Jesus doesn't give that many answers, Jesus changes the questions. Mm-hmm. So I think if we start to change the questions, we just end up on a different playing field altogether where different possibilities arise.
Excellent. Thank you. So there's a question kind of directed at me, but I want to give you guys an opportunity to respond as well. And if time allows, I'll give some closing remarks. It says, hi, Rob, I agree that there's a high level of ignorance in the Western evangelical environment. Do you think this is a willful ignorance or an ignorance of convenience whose purpose is not to disrupt long-held notions which play a part in forming a deep-seated paradigm? And I think that's a loaded question there. I think it's pastoral preservation at times. I think, the reality is that there's been a narrative that's been woven, and what we do is we end up weaving narratives to justify our theological convictions, and they reinforce one another. And then when something comes up that doesn't reinforce that, part of the problem is we have such a disunified, fragmented church that it's hard to even address these things without losing half your congregation. And I think, and this would be interesting to get some of your thoughts from our panel, I think we've lost the will to be prophetic. And I think what I heard from Munther earlier was, hey guys, this is not working. I don't care what label you use, but it's not working. I think it's time for the church to step up and say, we need to be prophetic like Jesus was at this time to our own community, calling our own sins forth. And that's what we addressed with Andy, of racism and discrimination and injustice towards the indigenous peoples. We live on a stolen land too. Let's be honest here. Let's start there. We live on a stolen land. And unless we reckon with that, we are not even going to be able to reckon with the question of Israel-Palestine. And I think, though, the point I would make then is not only do we need to be willing to stand up and do that, but we need to be really willing and ready to the fact that it may actually take us to our cross. It may cost us something. And that's fine. If your faith doesn't cost you something here at this point in time, I don't know, what are we doing? So I don't know if Munther or Hedva or Andy have a comment on that.
I can say something. I hope I don't come across as too strong. When I heard that the first question, what can the U.S. church do to help or so on, honestly, my first reaction was a blind cannot lead the blind. I think, you're right, Rob. I think there needs to be a lot of self-reflection, but it's not just self-reflection. I think there needs to be a lot of listening and learning from voices from the margins. Voices who are on the other side, voices who are in places of difficulty, oppression, marginalization, and humanize that and listen and then take cue and engage. Because even sometimes in our good intentions and when we want to be self-critical, and I'm mainly talking to my sisters and brothers here, the church. I think many times we assume we can do it by ourselves and we end up repeating the same patterns. And we cannot unless we listen and we engage and in humility accept that not just we're wrong, but there is a lot to learn from the voices that we've ignored and dehumanized over the years.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we're running low on time here, so we only have a few minutes left, and I want to give everybody 1 minute or more to, well, 1 minute is probably all you're going to have to kind of give your final thoughts. But there's one quick question here that came out. I'd like to, Hedva, if you can just address this quickly. The question was, what efforts are being made by the Messianic Jewish community to worship with the Palestinian Christians? Are there any, and can you speak to that at all?
This is a very painful subject for me. It used to be in the 90s, in the 2000s, it used to be more interaction between the Palestinian Christians and the Messianic Jews. In my humble opinion, when you do find it, it's very surface at the moment, because, as you know, people's political opinions have gotten into their churches and into their congregations. And so if you are a Messianic Jew and you believe in Israel and its right to exist, you make certain requirements of the Palestinians that you're willing to talk to. So I'm sorry, I don't have better news.
Okay, well, that's very good. Thank you. We have 1 minute each, if that's okay with you guys. And I'm not sure if you have anything else, Mercy, but 1 minute each. Andy, you're used to being on a clock, so we're going to start with you. Any closing thoughts that you want to, if you don't want to take your full minute, then somebody else can take 1 minute and 15 if need be. So Andy, you have any closing thoughts?
No, again, I think it's been a very entrenched thing, but again, I think we can actually change the paradigms. It's been done in many other groups. And if we kind of think outside the box, come up with different kinds of questions and practices, it's just been my experience. You have to ask us, would something get set up as we either have to care about Palestinians or Jewish people? You know, the setup's wrong. Right, so don't keep arguing in that setup. Change the setup. And anyway, and otherwise, I just want to thank Munther and Hedva. I've learned so much from your insights today, so I've greatly appreciated being able to be in this conversation.
Excellent, excellent. Munther, you're next on my panel. You want to go next?
Yeah, I'll take 2 minutes if that's okay. Looking at my notes, we don't have 2 minutes. I'll do my best. I think my first comment is to the church, to the Western Church, which is, you know, it's time that we act and it's time that we put aside shallow diplomacy. And let me put it this way: history will not be too kind. And I hope the church is not, as always, too late. And then 30 years later, speak about Martin Luther King or, you know, all these things, and then claim that we were, no, you know, and I don't think, you know, let's not apologize 30 years later and claim that we cared. The evidence is there. What's known, what should be done, you know what should be done. I think it's, and the second thing has to do with, you know, what should our response be to ideologies of apartheid? And our response cannot be yet another exclusive ideologies. So I want to stress the hope. And the hope is to share the land. The hope is to live as neighbors, as, you know, same rights, same privileges, same responsibilities. My hope is to end occupation. My hope is to end apartheid, but that's not it. My hope is to be really able to enjoy a good conversation and dinner with Hedva in our home one day without having to worry about checkpoints and barriers and so on. My hope is that we share the land as friends and as equals. So stressing apartheid is not just to say Israel is bad. Talking about apartheid, to me, is a mean that we want to live side by side with our Israeli neighbors. The current reality is the problem. We need to change it.
Amen. Excellent. Hedva.
I just want to let you know what Musalaha, what their focus is right now. We are a faith-based organization so that we engage in reconciliation mainly between Palestinians and Israelis, because we believe that Jesus has sent us to do it. And whoever participates in our program knows that. So because we don't have very many Messianic Jews that want to participate, you need to know that we have opened up and we have Muslims, Christians, and Israelis that are in our programs, secular or religious Jews, Muslims that are either covered or not, and also Christians. And we discuss so many things that bring us back to the gospel with the people that are in our programs. And I just wanted you to know that, because that is very hopeful.
Amen. Well, thank you guys so much. I think we're like 1 minute over, so I'm going to make this super quick, but we just want to thank everybody for attending. We want to remind you to sign up for our newsletter, nimi.network. Please stay informed, get involved. If you want to contact me personally as relationships manager, I'm Mercy at nimi.network. And please give. And big takeaway for me, relationship and prophetic. We need to develop both of these. This is, I think, our big call in the North American church with our Israeli and with our Palestinian brothers and sisters.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.
Mercy, one more thing. You can help sustain the work of NIMI and the fabulous webinars like this with a one-time monthly donation. You can go to nimi.network/donate. So I want to encourage
Thank
you to
you
do that
for
also.
reading this. I didn't
That's
see
right.
that.
Yeah.
Yes.
You're usually
Even better,
perfect at all those
donate
things.
monthly. We would love it.
Amen. Thank you. So
All
thank
right.
you guys so much for being on this. This was incredible. So I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
All right. You're welcome. Take care, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Bless you guys.